welcome everyone. I hope you're all safe and well during this difficult time. Thank you so much for joining us today for the third Oxford Climate Society event, the third of our 8-week series this term. My name is Alexis McGivern. I'm the Education Director at the Oxford Climate Society. I'm currently a master's student studying environmental change and management, and I'm part of Oxford's 1+1 program. So I start my MBA at the Said Business School in September. My research in my master's focuses on the relationship of race and income to the location of waste incinerator sites, both in the US and the UK. So this topic is one that is very near and dear to my heart. Oxford's Climate Society is part of Oxford University. We're aiming to develop the next generation of informed climate leaders. In addition to these weekly events, we run educational programs throughout the year. And as part of my role as Education Director, I run a program called School of Climate Change, which is a weekly workshop series where we run people, both students and townspeople of Oxford, through the kind of climate 101 that they need to know in order to be effective climate leaders. We also run the world's largest student-run climate journal, Anthroposphere, and we are currently working with the university to develop net zero policies and incorporate climate into every Oxford curriculum. So today we're going to be talking about race and class in a time of crisis. This current pandemic has really brought to the fore many of the deep inequalities within our society, especially in the global south, where the capacity to be socially distant is completely different, and where public health infrastructure is not able to keep up with the growing strains on it. Community spread has been a lot harder to control. The parallels with climate change are very clear. The people who are on the front lines of both of these crises and who will suffer the most are those who are the poorest and whose livelihoods are the most precarious. What this crisis has also shown us is the importance of global cooperation, because our ability to defeat this virus depends on each country's ability to contain it within its borders. In a highly connected and interdependent world, this is a much more difficult task and requires a great deal of international cooperation. In a very similar way, if a country decides to act only in its own self-interest rather than acting cooperatively to deal with the causes and impacts of climate change, we all stand to lose. Those who depend on the environment for their livelihoods stand to lose even more. So here to speak with us today is the fantastic Sunita Narain. I'm genuinely so excited to be speaking with her today. She is an incredibly effective and determined environmentalist who has been working tirelessly her whole life on the intersection between environment and development. Sunita is based in New Delhi and is the director for the Center for Science and Environment, as well as the editor of the magazine and blog Down to Earth, which I highly recommend that people go check out after this talk. Her work has been primarily focused on air pollution, water and waste management, as well as on the need for inclusive and sustainable growth. Sunita has taken on big polluters and has encouraged the government of India to tighten regulation, specifically by making evidence-based recommendations. The CSE has been monitoring air pollution levels around India since the 1980s. Sunita was a member of the Indian Prime Minister's Council on Climate Change, and in 2005 was awarded the Padma Shri, which is the 4th highest civilian honor. In the same year and under her leadership, the CSE was awarded the Stockholm Water Prize. In 2016, she was named one of the 100 most influential people by Time magazine, and she also appeared in Leonardo DiCaprio's documentary Before the Flood, speaking on the impacts of climate change in India and how the changing monsoons are affecting farming communities. So we're going to start this event by giving Sunita some time to make a short speech with her thoughts on this topic, followed by some questions from myself before opening it up to the audience. If you have any questions for Sunita, please write them in the live stream chat on the right-hand side of YouTube. So with that, I'll hand over to Sunita to give us her thoughts on this topic. Thank you so much for joining us, Sunita.
Thank you, Alex, and thanks so much for asking me. I mean, these are really weird times, surreal, in fact. But I think what makes it better is if we can communicate with each other, if we can talk to each other, if we can at least understand what is happening in our countries to our people. And from that, if we can find a way ahead. And I really genuinely believe that this COVID-19 should shake us more than any other event that we have seen in our own lifetimes. I mean, I have not seen the World War. My generation has not seen an event like this before, this kind of massive disruption. And I think for my generation, which is in some senses today at, is at the center of decision making. I mean, if this doesn't shake us, what will? And I think that's really important for us to keep in mind as we talk and as we think, because we need to think about what it is doing to us today, but we also need to think about what can we make of tomorrow. And even though, and this I say with some caution, Alex, and to all of you who are joining us today, I say this with some caution because I know that every time that you're in the midst of a pandemic, you're in the midst of a crisis, nobody wants to talk about what tomorrow. Because what tomorrow just seems such an academic issue. Just so, I don't have the mind space to talk about what will come tomorrow. But the fact is, if we don't learn today, we will have more of these tomorrow. And I think that's what we need to keep in mind and to talk about today for tomorrow. So that's really what I want to do. So as I said, these are tough, tough times. They are most grim. And I say this particularly for the poorest in the world. I mean, for people like you and me, we are locked in our homes, and if at most we are worried about the time we have to go out to exercise. But for the poor in the world and for the migrant laborers who you can see in my world, walking miles and miles to get home, it's a double jeopardy. On the one hand, they are the most vulnerable to disease because of their living conditions, because they live in overcrowded homes, because they have lack of sanitation, they have lack of water. I mean, I find it so amazing when institutions like WHO, rightly so, talk about washing your hands for 20 seconds under running water. I mean, the fact of the matter is millions in my part of the world, in our world, do not have access to that water. So we need to keep in mind that reality, and we need to keep in mind they are the most vulnerable to the spread of this disease. But the double jeopardy for them is that they are also the most devastated because of the collapse of the economy. They have no coping ability. They are invariably daily wage laborers. They have been shut out of their jobs. They have no sources of income to fall back upon. So you are really talking about a class of people, a huge class of people. And they may be brown in certain countries, they may be black in certain countries, but they are about that class of people who are most devastated because of COVID-19. And, in Delhi right now, I'm sitting when we have the cleanest air. We have cleaned up our skies. We have blue skies. We are seeing the reclaiming of nature as never before. We are seeing nature celebrating the fact that there is no honking of car horns, and you actually you hear birds today. But the irony of the matter is that we as environmentalists are not celebrating this. We cannot celebrate the blue skies that we have today because it is coming at such a huge cost and such a devastating cost on the poorest. This lockdown has definitely led to the reclaiming of nature, and is showing us how nature will get what nature needs to get back its blue skies, the scale of intervention we need, the changes in our economy we need so that combustion is clean, people don't travel in cars anymore. That's the scale. But we cannot celebrate this lockdown because it comes at such a massive cost. But the fact also is we want those blue skies. We want to protect our climate. So how can we learn from this lockdown? What can we learn from this so that we can improve both our environment and we can work towards a better future when it comes to climate change? So what do we learn? I think 3-4 issues that I want to highlight and then talk about what can we do differently. One, very clearly, as you very rightly said, Alex, in your introduction, the interconnectedness of the world. The fact is, when SARS happened, not very long ago, just about 2 decades ago, China was only 4% of the global GDP, Chinese economy. Today, it's 16% of the global GDP. The fact is, air travel takes the disease within weeks between one nation to another. And we have seen that happen. And it is not possible today to close down boundaries. We cannot do that because of the interconnectedness of the world. And that is as much true about COVID-19 as it is about climate change. We are an interconnected world. In this case, it is the virus that moves. The other case, it is the emissions that move. One airspace, one global atmospheric airspace. The second is we are an interdependent world. And that comes out so clearly when it comes to COVID. It's not just about between nations, but also within nations. The fact of the matter is, and this phrase just sticks in my mind, and I have to keep repeating it. We are as strong as our weakest link. And the fact with COVID is, if the virus today is growing in the homes of the poorest communities, in places where there is no possibility to have protection, where you cannot have testing at the scale that you need, where you cannot have treatment at the scale that you need, and if the virus continues to grow because people live in congested households, in congested colonies, it will grow in the region, it will grow in the country, it will grow across countries because of the interconnectedness of our nations. So interdependence between people and interconnectedness between countries and within nations as well. Today we have massive movements in India of migrants going back home. If they carry the virus back home, it will spread. And that is the nature of both climate change as well as COVID-19. But the fact of the matter is that the poor are worst hit. And this is why these are also, when it comes to climate change, when it comes to air pollution, comes to COVID, the poor are definitely the worst hit. But the fact is that these are great equalizers in our world as well. It is not as if the rich can protect themselves, that the rich can say we are secure because climate change will never affect us. The poor will be impacted today, but as emissions go up, the rich will equally be hit. It is the same with COVID, that you cannot say that, the poor, okay, slowly the disease will cease to happen in richer countries, just remain in where the poor live. But the fact is, if it stays, it will grow. If it survives, then it will definitely be something that none of us will be safe. And that is why it's very important for us to understand that when it comes to air pollution, I keep saying this in India, I keep saying this in Delhi, it's a great equalizer. You can use your face masks, you can use your air purifiers in homes, but the fact of the matter is we all have to breathe. And if the emissions of the SUV of the rich pollute the atmosphere, the airspace, the poor who don't have access to clean energy, those emissions will also pollute the same airspace. So we need to think together. We need to think of our interdependence here. And we need to think of an inclusive solution, because till now, not thinking that we are so interdependent, we have always thought that we could work for solutions which are good for certain parts of society and not for the rest. So I think what COVID, what climate change, what air pollution crisis brings us as sharply is that nothing will work unless it is inclusive. It is affordable development, inclusive development, which will be sustainable development. Take climate change. The fact of the matter is the rich need to reduce their emissions to make space for the poor to grow. If the poor grow, which they will emit. And as they emit, they will pollute the same atmospheric space, and there is no way we'll be able to keep any temperature control, the safeguards that we need to survive as humanity. It is a planetary catastrophe that we are looking at today. The third, what we have learned is that we have an extremely dystopian relationship with nature. Today, what COVID tells us so clearly is that we have transgressed the boundaries between nature and humans. And you are seeing the virus mutate between species and get stronger and stronger in its mutation, so that it is breaking every boundary. But it is because we are transgressing our relationship, changing our relationship with nature. We are also doing that with our industrial agricultural systems, because the way we are manufacturing our food, we are making it far more susceptible to disease. And as we make it more susceptible to disease, we are making it much more prone to virus attacks. And that really is where we are beginning to see the changes that we need to bring in our tomorrow so that we are protected. So it's an interconnected world, it's an interdependent world, and a relationship which is highly, highly dystopian. So what do we do? And this is where I want to throw some issues out today, and I look forward to some discussions on this. First, I think what we will need to discuss is very simply the future of work in our new society. And I'm not talking about the online, offline business. That's for you and me to think about. I'm talking about the future of work for millions of people. In my country today, millions are going back home because they believe they know they have no work and they cannot survive in our cities. These are people who are both extremely risked because of climate change, weather changes, and therefore their agricultural systems have been collapsing. They are extremely poor. They are marginal. They have been pushed out of their homes to come to cities to look for work. They have left countries to look for work. The whole issue of immigration has been the top issue in our world. It is because of which you have discussed Brexit, where you are sitting. It is the top conversation in our world. And today it is those same migrants who are saying, we want to go home, and they are going home. So what will this do to the future of work as we rebuild? I mean, is it going to give us an opportunity to think differently? Can we actually do new investments so that we can build rural, self-reliant economies, so that we can build a future where people live, where we can invest in creating local economies rather than just global economies? So we need to change the nature of globalization in ways in which we are investing much more into the resilience of our world. And resilience comes bottom up, never top down. So that becomes an opportunity to think and do things very differently. And it's a real question today. In my country today, with the millions going back, the question for government is, are they going to invest? Will they invest? Can they invest big time in creating a resilient rural economy so that people can get work and they don't have to leave? They can leave because they have a choice, but they don't have to leave. The second becomes the nature and the future of production. The fact is, today we are completely consumption-driven economies. And because of the nature of consumption, we have a crisis of climate change. Climate change is linked to consumption. You can talk about it in every other way, and we can make it big, big language, but it is at the end of the day about consumption. The more you consume, the more you will breach the planetary boundaries. So can you actually think about a globalized system which reinvents itself so that we don't anymore discount labor and environment? For so long, we have driven consumption because we have discounted the cost of environment and the cost of labor. Today, as the cost of labor will go up because people will demand more as they are going home, can we actually think about reinventing that? It's a big question for us in India. We are saying, oh, China, we want the business to come from China to India. But if we want the business to come from China to India, will we make sure that we do not discount labor cost? Will we make sure that we do not discount environmental cost so that we don't degrade our water, pollute our air, make it much more toxic and unsafe for us to live? And that's really where the last question that comes in is the future of democracy. Because that, to me, underpins every other question that we have, global democracy to local democracy. I am a strong believer, and I'm seeing this more and more, in what I call a NIMBY of the poor, not in my backyard of the poor. You talked about your research, which is on incinerators. And the fact of the matter is, in our world, we have always pushed waste management to the homes of the poor. We have got rid of it from our homes, pushed it away to the poor. But today, as democracy gets strengthened, and that's the big question, because all these questions I'm raising are really big questions. We can go the complete reverse as well. We can destroy democracy. We can get more consumption oriented. We can make sure that we invest more in the global than the local. We can do everything wrong as of now to make both the climate challenge worse as well as the COVID challenge worse. But that's my last point, that the future of democracy, because democracy basically means that the poor and the marginalized get a larger voice. The climate and the environmental problem has been made worse because we have never deepened democracy to give the poor the voice. We have always left democracy hanging somewhere in between. And as a result of it, it is only when the poor say, not in my backyard can you build the next incinerator. Not in my backyard can you have this waste dump. Not in my backyard can you have a thermal power plant that pollutes, that the rich will also reinvent their systems. Because till now, at least all over the world and in my world, what we have done is to shove it from our world to somebody else's. Our backyard is clean, not in my backyard, but somebody's backyard is polluted. So if we give a larger voice to the local, to the poor, to the people whose right it is to decide, we deepen democracy, and of course we reinvent global cooperation. But that's a zillion-dollar question, and I will end there. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, Sunita. That was fantastic. I mean, just such an accurate diagnosis of the problems and those three solutions that you laid out so beautifully of how we can move forward to a better future. My first question to you is going to be along those lines, which is that crisis can be a tipping point into a new reality. But as you were saying, we often focus on the sort of immediate relief instead of devoting attention to envisioning a new world. So in the UK, just a few days ago, we saw an announcement from the government that there would be a £2 billion investment in cycling and walking infrastructure as part of a green recovery to the pandemic. So given that you've laid out these three areas, which are big goals for the future, what do you think, either in India or globally, needs to happen right now to get us to those three futures? Is it whether that's funding that needs to go into the right place, or whether it's more equitable discussions at climate negotiations? I was wondering, from these three big visions, if you could see a few concrete steps forward.
You know, Alex, I think right now the crisis is on us. And I think that's where we are not talking long term, we are talking about now. And I read that announcement of the UK government. I've seen Milan has talked about investing more in cycling lanes. It's also coming out of a reality that public transport is going to be difficult to get back on track because it's congested. But what is also very clear is without public transport, we don't have viable economies. People can't move. Economies don't survive. So I think cycling is becoming an imperative, and it's wonderful to see that there is a win-win on both sides. You promote the cycling, you also get a green benefit, you get a health benefit, you get all the good things that we would want. Now, how do you get that conversation? And that's the point you're making. How do you make sure we don't lose this opportunity? How do we make sure that we can get some better decisions made today? I think this is where all our voices have to count. This is where we need to make sure that we can at least put the ideas out there with as much force as possible. And I think that's our role to do. And our role is to be able to get governments to understand that there is an opportunity to do things differently and that we want it to be different. I mean, I know it's difficult. I know very clearly, and I know that I'm not a romantic, be very clear, I'm too old in this. I've had too many struggles in this. I'm not romantic at all about all this too. I'm not some sort of dewy head, sort of eyed romantic in this to say, oh, we'll change the world, revolution is coming. I don't see any of that. But I do definitely see human nature being one which is today really shaken. We are terrified at what we have seen, the collapse. And it feels like a pack of cards. I mean, just think about it. It was in January that we were hearing about something happening in China. January. February, everything was normal. March, mid-March, we were traveling. We were making plans. And now the world, we are what? Not even mid-May? And we have a collapsed world. So I think we are shaken. I think this is the opportunity for us to get. Yes, you will have a lot of people, and I'm hearing it already. I hear it in the US in particular, and I'm worried about those. We need to be nuanced and effective, because I hear in the US, every time there is talk about a Green Deal, it's sort of seen as, oh, look, those crazy greenies are trying to bring their ideas on the table right now when we have such a crisis to get our economy back. We need the brown economy back. We need it to be black and dirty right now. We need to say we don't want it to be black and dirty. We can have it differently. So whether it is cycling, whether it is the reinvention of thermal comfort in our homes, because we cannot use air conditioners at the way we want to in our homes, whether it is about building more resilient rural economies, whether it is about changing production systems in India so that farmers can connect directly to markets, get back the value of their produce, whether it's about saying we need to pay a higher cost for the food because that's going into the hands of the farmers in my country, whether it's about building a risk insurance system, those are the opportunities we have today. I don't know how we'll get there, but I can only say we all just need to keep insisting on it.
That's a really interesting point, and I love the way that you laid that out with all these concrete steps that we can take. When we invited you to speak at this event, I really wanted to talk to you about this report that you co-authored called Global Warming in an Unequal World. I was mentioning that it was so influential and crystallizing for me when I read it about the role of environmental colonialism. So I wanted to give a bit of context for those who are tuning in who may not have read it, and I hope that I summarize it well. But this was a report in response to a World Resource Institute, so a WRI Institute report published in 1991 that stated that half of global emissions come from developing countries, and it was specifically focusing on the contributions of China and India. So you and your co-author Anil Agarwal argued that this report was a demonstration of being something that was less based on science and more on a politically motivated blame game that sought to place the consequences of climate change at the feet of emerging economies, rather than recognizing the extremely high historical emissions. And you found that using a different methodology that recognized the terrestrial emission sinks in China and India, and also changing the assumed deforestation rate in Brazil from one that you found to be hugely overinflated and based on a small region to a more realistic one, you found that the share of developing country emissions at that time fell to about 1/5 instead of half as WRI had reported it. Now, obviously the situation has changed a lot since 1991, but you noted at the time that there was a huge necessity for developing countries to do their own research and improve their own data collection so that the numbers on climate change were not coming only from the global north. So I have two questions on this report, which is first, How has this dynamic changed since you published that report now almost 30 years ago? And where do you think political judgments and political biases have been increasingly creeping into the science that may unfairly disadvantage emerging economies in the first instance?
Well, it's a very good question. But first, I must also just explain to everybody here that the report actually was because Anil and I were looking at goats. And I have to explain that context to you. You know, when the WRI report came out, and this is long time ago, 1991. At that time, you know, the whole, we really had never worked on climate change, but a sort of very flustered chief minister of an Himalayan state called Anil, and he said, you know, I've just been told by our minister, our Indian minister for environment, wrote a letter saying, listen, this report has come out and it now says that the methane emissions from cattle and rice are a major cause of climate change. And therefore, you must tell your people not to eat rice and not to grow rice and not to keep cattle. And so he called us and he said, listen, I just can't, I don't know what to say. How do I tell my people not to keep cattle? What will they keep? What will they do? And, you know, that really got Anil and me all thinking. We kept thinking that our understanding of environment was that the poor are worst affected by environmental degradation, that the poor subsistence economy is much more intensive in its use of environment, but it is the extractive economy of the rich, which is much more damaging to the environment in terms of the scale of the devastation. We said, what is happening? And that's when we began to understand the whole conversation to, I mean, and of course, as you very well explained, we looked at the science of it, and the two principles we came out of that report, which I believe are true today as well. We said, climate change is about a global atmospheric space, and every human being has an entitlement, a right to that global atmospheric space. And that right to the global atmospheric space must develop itself as a developmental right, as the right to that development, which means that you must be secured a basic right. And the second thing we said was there's a difference between survival emissions and luxury emissions. And that, to me, defines the conversation we've even had today. Now, you know, Alex, I've been in this for so long, and I have to say, I'll make a confession today to all of you who are listening in today, and it's a very personally private confession I'm making. I stopped working on climate change globally because my heart was completely broken. I just found I just could not go to the meetings and argue this position on equity and have I always felt there was always like two planets we lived in. It was a conversation of the deaf or the dumb, and that I could never get my point of view. This point of view was just negated. And the power of the Western media, the power of the Western NGOs, who would just completely subvert these arguments to say, oh, you know, these are not important at all. We need to talk about effective action, not issues of equity. And you're just covering up for the poor, for the rich in your country. This is not an argument that we can have. And I honestly, I just couldn't take it anymore. And I have backed off from a lot of active climate negotiations to say, listen, I can do something in India. I can try and fix the air of Delhi. I will kill myself, but we will work towards improving the air of Delhi. We will do something here. So in some senses, I personally removed myself from this discussion. But I believe that the issues that we raised haven't gone away, and they are back again. They are as important today as they were 30 years ago. Because if you don't have cooperation in this interdependent world, in this interconnected world, you cannot have an effective climate negotiation. You cannot have an effective climate deal. You cannot tell the poor in the world, you don't have the right to a light bulb. You do not have the right to be aspirational and move to a car. You cannot do that. You cannot finger point. You will have to build a cooperative model. And that is where I believe what Anil, and you have to, I think an environmentalist who died just too early, if he had been here, he would have really made us do a lot more thinking on this. But I think Anil, what we said in 1991 in Global Warming in an Unequal World, a case of environmental colonialism, I think it is here to haunt us again. Those issues have not gone away. COVID-19, climate change, air pollution, they all have the seed of, call it colonialism, call it the lack of equity, inclusion, but it is all about building a society in which we cannot care for the poor, and so we cannot build a society only for the rich.
Absolutely. And when you speak to those inequities on the table in climate negotiations, in my previous role before I came to Oxford, I was involved in representing my organization at a negotiations at the UN to build a convention on plastic pollution, and just the difference between the kind of visible power that was evident there, and then the sort of invisible advantages, like the number of negotiators that were there, that, at the US bringing 8 delegates versus all other countries having 1 or 2. And I found that to be very, very stark. And it's something that is in all negotiations, same in the climate change negotiations that just happened in December. So I was wondering if you could speak to your discussions on environmentalism of the poor versus environmentalism of the rich, and if you could walk us through your viewpoint on that.
Yes, of course. This has been something I'm very passionate about. I keep talking about how when I was a student, I joined the environmental movement. Set up a small environmental organization, nothing like your society, small organization based in Delhi. I was part of it. And one of the first things that we had done was to go up to see the women of Chipko in the Himalayas, Indian Himalayas, who were protecting the trees and not letting the woodcutters cut them. And the question that we had at that stage was, why should poor women care about the environment? And it was really about their survival. And we misunderstood the Chipko movement to say that Chipko movement was about conservation. Actually, it was a movement asking for development rights, the right to cut the tree, but saying that because they are dependent on the trees, they survive on the trees, they will cut and regrow the trees. They will cut only as much as they need. So in some senses, that was the environmentalism of the poor. But the environmentalism of the middle class, which is what we are seeing today, is one in which we have moved the problem. We are always behind the curve because, we pollute, we clean up, and then we find the pollution has become worse. So when it comes to air pollution, we thought we had cleaned up when we got rid of PM10, and we cleaned up the quality of diesel, of petrol in our cities. But then we found that actually by improving the technology of our vehicles, we have reduced the size of the particle. So from PM10, we went to PM2.5, and now we are getting to nanoparticle. When we changed from Euro 4 or BS4 to BS5, we realized that we had actually reduced the particles, but increased the NOx because of the increase in the burning temperature in our vehicles. So the point I'm making is we always stay behind the problem. And and that really has meant that we have never been able to find answers to the climate crisis because we are always behind the curve. We are fixing and we are finding new problems. And that's the environmentalism of the middle class. Middle class, the rich, the middle environmentalism of the rich versus the poor. And that's where the whole NIMBY issue comes in, not in my backyard. Can you think of not in my backyard? So that it is the poor who are saying, not in my backyard. Just think how it changes. In one city of Kerala, a state in India, It is, and this is growing across other cities of India as well. It is the poor villages who are saying now, we will not let you locate a waste dump in our village. We will not let you build an incinerator in our village. Now, as this city, the capital city of Kerala, couldn't get to a place where it could take its waste, the city now has to reinvent its own waste management system. It has to segregate, it has to recycle, it has to process its waste because it has no place for incinerating or to dump its waste. So I see this environmentalism of the poor versus the rich becoming the way in which we can learn from the poor, their adaptive capacities, their resilience, their ability to live with nature, their not so dystopian relationship with nature, to build a better environmentalism for the whole world.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for laying that out for us. Speaking of the Chipko movement, we have Vandana Shiva who's speaking in a few weeks within the webinar series. So yeah, I'm really excited to listen to that. So we have some really fantastic questions that have come in from the audience. So the first one is, as you say, democracy needs to become stronger and the marginalized voice needs to grow stronger as well. How can we persuade these people that tackling climate change is in their own interest when it appears abstract in comparison to the tangible pressures of the present, like feeding their families or keeping their jobs?
You know, this is a very good question, but I think we have got it by the wrong end of the stick. The fact of the matter is, you know, I keep saying, if you use the word climate change, the poor in India will not understand it. Farmers don't understand climate change. But they understand climate change. They understand what's happening to their weather. They understand the kind of impact of the weather on their lives. And if we tell them that this is really, you have the choice to be able to deal with this, I believe they will make very wise choices. So I think strengthening local democracy, we need to have faith in people. It's a leap of faith. I think to some extent, we have been so used to thinking that we know and we'll have to tell them how to do things differently. I think in some level, we are asking for a leap of faith. We're saying, you know, they understand the pain of the environment. They understand what COVID is doing to them today. I mean, you talk to the poor of India today, and there have been so many voices coming out. They understand. They know this is a disease which they don't have the money to go to hospitals. And even if they had the hospitals, they will not get the care that is needed. They will take precautions. Yes, they also want livelihoods. But that's really where we have to prepare and to give opportunities for livelihoods which are cleaner and greener. And I think that's where the role of the state comes in. That's where all of us, it's not just about deepening democracy and saying, now it's your job, you do it. No, it's about giving them the right to decide, but giving them the options. And that's the options are where we need to work much more on it. I mean, today in India, we're talking about opening up industry again. Small scale sector is a critical part of our economy. But the small scale sector is the worst when it comes to its environmental record, when it comes to its labor record. So can we think about how we can actually think about cleaner fuel to them so that they can operate, but without pollution? So I think those are the opportunities that we need to look at.
Fantastic. We have another great question here, which is, how can we ensure both a green and a just transition to decarbonization in developing countries? And to what extent can technology be used to ensure a more equitable and sustainable future for the world's poorest?
You know, this is a question that I never know how to answer, because technology is a means to an end, in my view. And the point is, we need to figure out what we first need to do. I mean, I'll give you an example of an area that I work very much in, shit, excreta. This is something I do a lot of work in India. CSC does a lot of work. I work on it a lot. Now, if you look at it, technology is an answer here. You could argue that the rest of the world has used technology to clean up excreta and to clean up its rivers. You have got underground sewage. You take the water from your flush toilet, you intercept it in underground sewage networks, you take it to a treatment plant, you treat it there, and once it is well treated, you put it back into the river. And that's how Thames has got cleaned up, Hudson has got cleaned up, you've cleaned up your rivers. So technology is the answer. But technology is an extremely powerful tool for creating inequities in society as well. The same technology of an underground, of a flush toilet, an underground sewage network connected to a treatment plant is an extremely resource-intensive, capital-intensive system, which means it divides between the rich and the poor in our society. So when in my part of the world, when our city governments start building these technologies, they reach flush toilets connected to underground sewage to very small, minuscule number of people in our cities, the rich. And because they run out of money, they do not have the ability to provide sanitation to larger numbers of people. So technology as a tool can become a tool for creating inequities and class divisions in society. But if you were to rethink that technology and say, listen, people excrete, people have septic tanks where they have on-site systems where their sewage goes. Can I rework my technology so that it is nimble, it is much more mobile oriented? I can collect the sewage from each household, take it to a plant, treat it and reuse it back on the land. I can close the nitrogen cycle. I can do it so that it is cost effective, it is cheaper, it is more inclusive. So I know I'm giving you a very long-winded answer to the person who asked this very important question, but please forgive me. I'm trying to explain to you that the way I look at it is that technology is really a tool for building that. You know, if you understand the need for an inclusive, equitable, just future, then you will look for the technologies that provide you an ability to have affordable futures as well. And for me, the shit example is the best example, because if I can have an affordable shit management system, which can reach every household, take the shit of every household and treat it and reuse it as a resource, you have actually created a much better water management systems, improved the health and well-being of large numbers of people. But that's where the use of technology gets important.
So interesting. I just spent the last month writing a paper on excreta management in India, so this is very relevant. So we have another great question here, which is, what will it take to make Western powers, including NGOs, to understand that climate change is just as much an issue of equity as it is of better choices and policy? Or are their corporate agendas too great for them to ever admit this? Great question.
I don't know how to answer this. I have, it's a personal answer. I have got faith today and a renewed sense that it's possible out of the voices I'm seeing of the young people coming out of the Western world. I see when the Western environmental movement is talking about climate change, I find them much more understanding of the issues of equity, of the issues of class, of the issues of race. And the young movement, the movement of the young on climate change, I think has been able to speak truth to power. It has anger, it has passion, but also and this has really given me a sense of encouragement and courage, is that I see in them, they are not so gentle, what's the word? They haven't become so genteel and so sort of, they're not covering up the hardness of the world. They're willing to recognize the hard truth, and they're willing to confront it. And I think that, to me, gives me a lot of faith. And I think maybe that's where I don't know if the established Western civil society or the established governments in the Western world will understand the issues of equity, of justice, because I see them. I have honestly given up on that. But I do definitely see the voices of the young, their cry for justice is one which gives me faith, because it has just, every time I have read them, every time I've heard them, they have been strong enough to call out the black and the white. And I think, I'm hoping that they will keep their voice, they will keep their anger, they will keep their commitment to a just world, and only because it is just, it is more sustainable. And that we will learn from it.
I completely agree. I think one of my favorite moments from this past year was going to the big Fridays for the Future strikes, and just seeing children as young as 10 years old just speaking such truth to power and diagnosing these issues so accurately. So there's a great question on this kind of theme of the future of education in light of climate change and COVID-19. And this question is, in particular, do you see climate justice finding a place within the climate change education? And to add my own little extra bit onto that is, do you think that would foster kind of a different leaders on climate if this were to be foregrounded more purposefully in climate change education from early on?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I think the conversation we're having today is part of it. Okay, let's be clear. And I think one of my most frustrating moments has been that we do not seem to talk. We don't have dialogues. We don't learn. We don't build this into our own thinking. It's something, and I think it's a very powerful. I mean, I'm a product of education. We all are. We're a product of what we have learned in our families. We are products of what we have been taught in schools, in universities. We have been shaped. Our minds have been shaped not just by what we have read, but what we have discussed, what we have understood is the conversation around us. And over the years, and I think that's where maybe COVID is a tipping point, maybe one more of those tipping points. But over the last some years, we have become so bubbleized. We've become so comfortable in our little bubbles. We speak only to the people who agree with us. We read only the people who we agree with. Okay, we have become so comfortable in these little bubbles, and I think COVID has done this. Is that it has shaken those bubbles. It has burst those bubbles. We are forced to see images today and understand that it is the disease. Why is the disease growing? And it's no longer growing only where the poor are. It's also in our backyards. It's also in where we live. It's our near and dear who we are losing to this disease. So it's breaking every barrier. It's forcing us to understand where the other side live. I mean, for me, the most classic was Singapore. I mean, just think about it. Singapore was seen as this ultra clean city, which was seen to be, as soon as when COVID-19 happened, we all said, oh, Singapore, no problem. They will deal with it. They are so powerful. They know how to deal with it. And it's an amazing government. There is no doubt. And they will handle it. I mean, and Singapore has such amazing systems for personal hygiene, for cleanliness, for control. They will deal with it. But Singapore has found that where the disease is growing is in its migrant homes. It never even understood that they have vast labor living in what could only be called the modern shanties of the world. I mean, yes, they're not as bad as the slums in India, no question about it. They have better living conditions than the slums in India or Kenya or other parts of the impoverished world, but they are shanties. And the virus is growing there, and it is going to affect the economy of this island country, and it is therefore making it more difficult for them to control it. So I think these are the issues in which we need to really think about for the future, and that's why education is important. That's why education is critical. We need to bring the other side into our homes, into our classrooms, the marginalized, the poor. Our media has cleaned them up. They've just become these lovely images we see without really understanding. We see some really bad war and then we just switch off, but we don't see the connections. So I think education is critical, inclusive education.
Absolutely, I completely agree. I have one last final great question from the audience, which is how can we further connect with other movements of equity, race, and class? This is from the question, as you mentioned, the discussion needs to move to that of democracy if the climate movement is to be successful. But given what you've just said about making sure that we're learning from one another, I'm curious if you see more intersections that we may not have tapped yet in terms of these relationships between equity, race, and class.
See, I think, I'm a strategist. So I look at what can you do to get things done. And I think the world is also so fast, we're running out of time. We just talked about, one of your first questions to me was, here is an opportunity. What do we do to make sure that we don't get it wrong? Now, this is where I think we need to be strategic, make connections today, make alliances today, but all pushing towards what we can actually do to change. And I think that's where I think there are lots of amazing groups working across the world, and I could spend a lot of my time networking with everybody. But I would prefer to network today to say, okay, here is an opportunity to get cycling back in our cities. What can I do to do that? How can I make the connections? What can I make sure that the poor and the rich both benefit from it? It doesn't become a class divide, that the cute little rich cyclists out there, the poor are not able to cycle. So how do I make sure that that happens? So I think, my answer, and I know I'm not doing justice to the very important question that I was asked on this, but my answer right now is, we've really run out of time and place. I mean, we are just dealing with COVID, and we are all clear today. Governments are saying to us, learn to live with this disease. I mean, that's the message we are getting from our governments, which is really saying to us, we are going to have to deal with the disease and economy together, which means they've also understood that it's here for some time to stay. Yes, we may have a vaccine, we may have some cure, but the disease is here with us for some time. Now, at the same time, there is climate change. It's happening in our worlds today. It's not going away. We have a locust attack coming in parts of Africa right now. We've had locust attacks last year, all because of the changing nature of the rainfall patterns. You're seeing massive devastation to the livelihoods of the poor because of the extreme rain events that are beginning to happen in our world. So I think that is not going away. Climate change is on a spiral and it's already there. And one little dip because of COVID is not going to make climate change go away. So we have the second crisis. And for us in Delhi, we have winter coming. We have air pollution as a crisis coming up. We need to do something about it now. We need to do something about the migrants going home now. So I just want to impress upon us all the urgency of action at this time, and the need to push our governments to act and hold them accountable for not acting. So I think that's really where all our focus needs to be.
What a great call to action. I wanted to ask, and this is not necessarily on the topic of this webinar, but I was just curious, in heading up the Center for Science and Environment and your work in, informing the best paths forward and calling for stricter regulation, I was wondering how you balance between honoring the reality of the science and the urgency of the science, while also recognizing what is politically feasible, because those are two very different sides of the same coin of complexity. I was wondering if you could speak to that.
We're always looking for answers which give us both. And that has to be the way we have to move on it. And we're very strategic, because you're very right. We are an organization which is always looking to do something, get something done. And we recognize we live in India, we live in, we work in a region, and we work in Africa, we live in, in this region. I can't say, oh, bring solar energy and change everybody's life. It's not going to, we don't have the money, the abilities to do so. So how can we make solar work? What are the spaces for solar to succeed? So the first answer becomes the whole issue of energy access. We have large numbers of poor women, don't have access to cooking fuel. Can you look at alternative energy sources for them? Can you find a win-win so that they can gain and we can have renewable energy? When it comes to air pollution, we're constantly pushing for public transport, because we've recognized the fact that very little of India actually moves in a car. But then when we are reinventing the public transport system, we're also very clear it has to be modern enough, convenient enough. So you have to look for answers which can actually work their way to work for both, Can you look for cleaner sources of energy? Can you find ways of... So you have to be able to speak to the reality, and you have to find answers for your reality. And what I find, Alex, and I think that gives me a lot of hope. We've never run out of those answers. We've never been able to not find a solution. I mean, when it came to shit management, my favorite, I'm sorry, I keep going back to shit. It's one of my favorite issues that I work on. I mean, the fact is, the way we've explained it to our governments is that, listen, when we had the cell phone revolution, we stopped doing landlines and we went, today everybody has a phone. When you're talking about the grid, you're talking about mini grids and you're talking about decentralized grid systems. Why can't you talk about toilet systems so that they're on site, they're nimble, they provide for the poor? So I think for me, and I'm speaking as for CSC and for me, I think the most important thing is we must remain very rooted to the principles that we believe in. So when CSC works, for us, it is not about what we are doing, but why we are doing it. And why we are doing it is rooted in societal principles. We believe in the principle of justice, of equity, and of an inclusive development. So when the answers we look for, we are also looking for answers for inclusive development. And I think that is where you've always got to look for those. And they're not easy, and sometimes we get them wrong, but we have to keep looking for them.
That's amazing. Well, Sunita, I just wanted to thank you so much for such a fascinating, interesting, and inspiring conversation. I wanted to give you a space to have any final points or concluding remarks that you want to leave us with.
No, just to say thank you so much for asking me and for listening to me so patiently, everyone who's listening to this. And, I don't know what kind of a new world we will have, but I do believe that if we are brave enough, it's not a brave new world, but it is about us being brave enough, courageous enough to talk truth to power and to say what we really believe has gone wrong in our world. Maybe, just maybe, we will get it right the next time around. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sunita. Thank you so much to everyone who is tuning in. We really appreciate it. We hope that you enjoyed this discussion, and thank you especially to those of you who wrote in such brilliant questions. It was such a pleasure to see those. So we have our next event on Monday, which is on the impact of sort of on the impact of climate policy with two brilliant speakers. We have Professor Jim Skia, who is the chair of Working Group 3 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, so the IPCC, and Professor Kevin Anderson, who is a professor of energy and climate change, who holds a joint position at the University of Manchester and the University of Uppsala. So please tune in if you're interested, and for more details, please check our Facebook page and our website. So thanks again to everyone for tuning in, and thank you so much to Sunita for your time and your brilliant insights. It was such a genuine pleasure to speak with you, and yeah, thank you so much, and take care to everyone else, and hopefully see you at some of our events soon.